Oh, go on, right? Oh, great. No problem. Well, thanks for having me up here. I've never actually been in this particular part of Mayo before. It's quite spectacular, and I can see why people are fighting so assiduously to keep it in that manner. I've been asked to say a little bit about the 1916 Rising and issues arising from it. My good friend Finbar will then develop that in a different manner with a more political focus than I'm going to have. So, as I think is appropriate for a general audience, even one that has a lot of expertise within it, I think I should say a little bit about the gestation of what became the Easter 1916 Rising, the motivation of those who participated, and something of its course. Now, it's obviously not the time or place for a full-blown lecture on the Rising. That's a different sort of thing. But it's important, I think, to bear in mind, this wasn't any sort of knee-jerk reflexive thing that suddenly happened just because the bulk of the British professional standing army was on the Western Front. Indeed, it was 2 years into the so-called Great War before the Irish Republican Brotherhood, using the vehicle of the Irish Volunteers, struck as such in Dublin in conjunction with the Irish Citizen Army and others to bring the Irish Republic into being. Now, there's a great deal to be said about that. All those groups have a complicated past. Even the history of the Irish Citizen Army involves predominantly James Connolly, who's often underrated in that regard, Larkin, Captain White, and even Sean O'Casey, who became a problematic figure for his own organisation at a certain point. Again, you could justify a lecture stream on that alone, so I won't be doing that. So if you've never heard anything about 1916, I'll tell you something today, and perhaps another time I'll come back and tell you a bit more if you like. That's if I'll run out of town and ask not to return. For me, the countdown to what happened from the 24th of April 1916 is in around 1907, with the return of Tom Clark from an extended sojourn in New York State and formerly New York City. Clark, the ex-Fenian and very senior member of Clan Gael, had been a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood before he went to America for the first time, and before he went back to England to take part in the Dynamite Campaign in the 1880s. His connections with the Daly family of Limerick, with whom he had the displeasure of spending time in an English dungeon, the great John Daly, the arch-Fenian of the west and south of Ireland, gave him a level of entree which he wouldn't have ordinarily have secured as a grassroots member of that organisation. But by 1898-1899, he was recognised as a very capable person within that revolutionary tradition. In 1907, effectively, contrary to what you read in most history books, John Devoy, the leading figure of the East Coast United States in Clan Gael, the ultra-republican organisation, I suppose, sent him back to Dublin as his emissary. Now, what his wife has written about that is quite simply incorrect and belied by some of our later statements that have recently come to light. He was sent back by the Clan to take part in a revival of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the sister organisation of the Clan, which are planning assiduously to foment revolution in Ireland, to bring a democratic sovereign republic into being. Now, they didn't plan for a socialist republic, but they did want a democratic republic. And in the heady environment of 1910s, there wasn't much difference. There wasn't much difference. Any true republic in the 1910s and 1920s was reflexively a socialist also, not a nationalist. A nationalist is someone who could settle for a monarchy, who could settle for irredentism, could settle for the imposition of one form of culture over everybody else, and see fit to extend their territorial borders in a hostile imperialist manner. That's okay within nationalism. Most imperialists are nationalists. Republicans don't see it that way, and I'll explain the difference later on. Perhaps Finbar might touch on this himself. But from 1907, the revival of the Clan Gael structures in the United States, which were extensive and powerful and well-resourced, was matched by a new generation of leadership influenced by their American associates in Ireland. And that's where people like Tom Clark, Sean McDermott, Bulmer Hobson coalesce alongside John Devoy in New York, Joe McGarity in Philadelphia, and a man called J.T. Keating in Chicago, who would be very surprised if any you ever heard of, and many others. Those three Irish Americans comprise the revolutionary directory of the Clan. So, the question is, what would be the optimum conditions for bringing a revolution into being? If you want to bring about democracy in Ireland, let alone a republican sovereign entity, and break Dublin as such out of the British Empire, you have an uphill task. You're dealing with the most powerful empire in the world at its height. Moreover, it's our nearest neighbour. It's not the advantage of striking in New England in the 1770s. They're across the water, and it's not that far. You can see Wales on a good day from parts of the east coast. You can see Scotland from parts of the north coast. It's not far. The eastern seaboard in those days had many more functioning ports. There was a vast amount of sea traffic and considerable migration of our people typically in the other direction. The British military presence in Ireland was massive and backed up by the very, very extensive Royal Irish Constabulary, who, as I'm sure many of you know, received their royal entitlement from suppressing the 1867 Fenian uprising. Well, the new generation Fenians, the IRB and the Clan, wanted a more refined version of that. And to do this, ideally what you want is a much bigger front organisation that's militant in nature, that you can recruit and radicalise, that you can utilise as your sort of front group. You will never have a revolutionary organisation of 200,000 people, because by the time your membership sort of hits 2,000 or 3,000, you'll all be in jail or dead. It's just not going to happen. There must be, certainly in the 20th century, a revolutionary vanguard who are capable of disposing a sufficient element of the people to act in a very concerted, disciplined manner, and that is what a coup d'etat would require. Now, winning the field for one day or 1 week is one thing, but defending it against inevitable counterattack is another. And certainly, it would be inconceivable to raise an armed force in Ireland sufficiently strong to defeat the resources of the British Empire. So what you have to do is an early form of armed struggle. You must have a sufficient political platform that appeals, once revealed, to a sufficient portion of the body to give you political strength and depth, and therefore indispose your enemy to do what they can do materially. If you can recruit international allies who will agree to back you morally, and then perhaps even financially and practically, so much the better. And that is exactly what the 1916 proclamation is about. Now, judging any organisation, there's only two major ways I think that can be done. One is to judge them by their stated intentions and to measure that against their actions. Plans are fine, contingencies are grand, all organisations have them, but in terms of a historical assessment, a proper, in-depth, thorough analysis, you have to go through their stated actions and what they did on the ground. And that's something we can do with 1916, even though itself did not, as we all know, lead to the actual establishment of a de facto Irish Republic. Morally, it did, but in terms of practical terms, of course not. It is no coincidence that when the Home Rule Bill crisis got worse and worse after 1912, and where non-democratic elements within the British parliamentary structure, specifically the Conservative Party in opposition, and elements of the treasonous elements of the armed forces of Great Britain and Ireland, began to collude against the House of Commons, and indeed the neutered House of Lords, to prevent a very moderate level of devolution of authority back to Dublin for the first time since the 1st of January 1801, that the people like the IRB could sense a stiffening of public opinion. There's no way of really taking the temperature of people, because no women and only a few men could vote anyway. The electorate itself was not significant, and there was certainly no constitutional path to the Irish Republic. Whatever's going to happen is never going to come to the ballot box. You would never be allowed to dispose yourselves to espouse those politics by London. It's not in their strategic selfish interest. It was not going to happen. So the revolutionary option was the only thing that could get the Republic. But it might be possible, it might have been possible, to use a springboard of Home Rule, some form of devolved authority where you would have, if you like, an inching of authority towards the nascent middle classes in Dublin and in the provinces, which could, in time, create a more, I suppose, fertile environment for radicalism. Now, the experience of the lockout in 1913 suggests that this would not be the case, that the employers, backed by basically a limitless fund, backed by the so-called RIC, and the Dublin Metropolitan Police, who disgraced themselves, a hitherto quite popular and morally regenerate force that disgraced themselves in their activities during the lockout. It was quite clear that the people who expected to take power in a devolved Dublin Assembly or devolved Dublin Parliament were going to be the Murphyites. That's who was going to be on the franchise. Because remember, this is before the extension of franchise in 1818. So only a minority of men could vote. And it was very much still linked to property and indeed therefore social position. It was never going to reflect the popular interest. Now, the IRB did not care a jot for democratic processes in terms of achieving their aims. What they wanted to do was to force a fait accompli, seize power, indispose the British from attacking, and therefore, as a provisional government, bring in the most democratic level of power sharing in the Western world, which is quite ambitious. Would they have turned themselves into a military dictatorship? We'll never know, but it seems very unlikely. Even the victorious blue shirts in the Irish Civil War didn't do that. They came pretty close, particularly under the late lamented General Michael Collins, but they didn't do it. They resisted the temptation to go full bore to the right. So, just to give you a quick outline of events. The threat to Home Rule led to the formation, but threat to Home Rule rather, by the Ulster Volunteer Force, this illegal paramilitary mass-based group, strong only in the north of Ireland, with pockets of support in Dublin, namely the Guinness family and others. They were threatening to bring extra parliamentary politics into the streets and into the fields of certainly the eastern seaboard and the northeast part of the country, with deliberately horrifying projections of mass bloodletting, civil war and whatever. It's strange how indecisive the RIC were on that occasion, how powerless the magistrates were, how ineffective the massive garrison forces of these islands were to deal with, basically speaking, a revolutionary conspiracy. However, this is life in pre-democratic Britain and Ireland. The formation of Ogoni, and that was their first title, aka the Irish Volunteers, aka the IRA, and they were called the IRA in 1916, which is something people don't often realise. It's not stressed in the standard history books, but it is the case. The Irish Volunteers was much more reflective of the general opinion in Ireland. Most of those who swore themselves into the Irish Volunteers to defend the Home Rule interest were not men who could vote. Right? They're people who were being sort of excluded from society, but saw a civic duty to defend Home Rule nonetheless. No doubt there was a certain level of self-interest in this, but it's also common sense. You can't allow a small, self-defined, secessionist minority, dispose the whole of this country towards basically further subjugation. That's completely unjust. And the British government wouldn't do something about it. Someone's going to have to. It was an imperative. Behind the Irish Volunteers from the very start, to an extent that is still not fully documented, was the IRB, and particularly people like Clark, MacDonagh and Hobson. Some of their unaligned associates were manoeuvred by them into position, such as Roger Casement, the great anti-imperialist, the O'Rahilly and others. These were people who were very close to thinking of the IRB. And another former famous figure, Major John McBride. He's also like a floating Republican who, into 1913, had been on the Supreme Council of the IRB. And again, that's often not said about McBride. Whatever his penchant and maybe drinking too much on occasion and his acrimonious marriage, there was a lot more to him than that, because he convinced very serious people that he was one of their number. And when push came to shove, he turned out in Jacob's Mill garrison and was shot because of it. Other groups that were critical to the story are the Irish Citizen Army, a socialist workers' militia, effectively armed trade unionists who became deeply politicised, were very ideological by the typical standards of European militias. Possibly, arguably, the most significant workers' militia in Western Europe, and definitely one of them, because they were getting such profound leadership from people like Connolly, paramilitary training from Captain White, charismatic encouragement from Larkin before he went to America. There was quite a high talent pool there. These were people who lived beside each other and worked together and knew each other. They were hardened by the experiences of the lockout in which they were formed. And once they're formed, there's no more shooting people down in the streets. Other people are getting beaten up. That's not necessarily the striking workers. So it was robust. They were blooded. And moreover, they showed themselves the equal of, I suppose, the bullying aspect of the DMP and the waiting RIC, which was quite significant. Another auxiliary that was significant were Cumann na mBan. The Irish Republicans and advanced nationalists, if you want to use that phrase, were very progressive by world standards, and certainly Western European standards, in enabling and empowering women. Now that's the way it had to be, because women had no political power whatsoever, except such as they could exert on a personal level through men. But in the case of the Irish Volunteers, the creation of the Cumann na mBan Auxiliary, which was strongly Republican in politics, was quite significant. And when push came to shove, more than 70, and it is more than 70, took part in 1916 at a time when there were no women in anything close to combat conditions on the Western Front anywhere. In fact, whilst there was a very important behind-the-lines role of women throughout the armed forces of the Western world, is Cumann na mBan who were the ones carrying dispatches, moving weapons, engaging in spying, things for which they would have been shot if captured on the Western Front by the British. This is what that would have been regarded as illegal activities. Two smaller groups, one is Na Fianna Éireann. Na Fianna Éireann were a Republican youth organisation, as I'm sure you well know. Hobson and Markovich were significant in that. They were effectively another tool of the IRB, and there's a very disproportionate flow of members
from the sort of radicalised, trained youth into the deeper level of the conspiracy, which was the Republican movement as expressed in the form of the IRB. And another very small organisation, but one that's significant in the long term, the Hibernian Rifles. Now, the Hibernian Rifles are an offshoot of the ancient Order of Hibernians Irish-American Alliance, and they're not to be confused with the AOH Board of Erin, following Joe Devlin, who are effectively I suppose, the street toughs and the funders of the Irish Parliamentary Party, with a particular centre of strength in Belfast. Now, many of the AOH Board of Erin, Devlinites, were nationalists, and they did want change, and they vehemently believed in securing home rule, but many of them would have regarded that as a sufficient end point. Within there were individual Republicans, incidentally, just confused about it. But the ones who turned out and fight in 1916 are the Irish-American Alliance, the Hibernian Rifles, led by J.J. Scollin from Derry. Well, the countdown to this is quite simply outlined, and I'll try and keep this very short. You have the volunteers in harmony with the Irish Citizen Army, particularly from the early part of 1914, and there's quite a lot of joint demonstrations. There's quite a lot of Bodenstown, for instance. It's not just the famous Lord of Monrossa funeral, which is extremely significant. Prior to that, you also had the presence of the ICA marching at Bodenstown, and that's important. So there's a meeting of minds within those who are armed and prepared to defend Irish national interests, and indeed to secure Irish national interests in the face of anti-home rule and British dithering. In February 1914, Pearse, the director of organisation, came to the US. That is conventionally described as a fundraising tour for his very visionary educational experiment, St. Enda's and St. Eata's, right? And that's correct, that was part of it. He did most of his activities and most of his fundraising for the equipment fund of the Irish Volunteers. That was fully understood. By the time he came to the United States, he was a fully fledged member of the IRB, had been inducted at the behest of Clark. Now, he was always the right sort, as far as they're concerned, but increasingly Pearse is the public face of the Supreme Council of the IRB. Around the same time, the other colleague, Hobson, arrived. Later on, Dermot Lynch, who many people have not heard of. Dermot Lynch was a long-term American citizen, Cork-born, Gaelic League activist, amongst other cultural endeavours. Lynch is one of the most significant Republicans of the period who is little known because he wasn't shot. If Lynch had been killed, he'd be up in the pantheon with the rest of them. In fact, he was far more important, actually, than many of those who were shot. Far more. Thomas Ashe, fated to be the first man, the first IRA hunger striker to die in the 20th century. Ashe was with Lynch on their clandestine tour, ostensibly to take part in Gaelic League activities, actually to liaise with the clan structures. Because it was through the clan that the conduit of German armaments became a realistic prospect. Now, as is well known, the UVF, despite their protestations of loyalty, had imported colossal amounts of weaponry into Larne and Bangor earlier in that year. The Irish Volunteers were desperate to respond in even a token manner. John Devoy put up the money. Alice Stopford Green in London acquired money on the basis of a loan in her circle of pro-Irish people in the imperial capital. And indeed, 1,500 rifles were procured and run into Holt and Kilcool in the last week of July and the first day of August 1914. That was the signal the clan in America were waiting for, to realise there was a functioning revolutionary conspiracy in Ireland in which they could invest. Immediately, serious sums of money are channeled to Clark at Dublin and indeed to those collecting on behalf of the organisation in America. Now, August 1914 is when Britain declared war on Germany. More to the point, they did something that no one really expected. They did send the expeditionary force to Flanders. They said they would on the Entente Cordiale, but they did, which is something the Germans hadn't counted on, believe it or not, and has very serious consequences in terms of the conduct of the First World War. That also settles one issue of the Irish-American lobby, Ireland's opportunity, being Britain's difficulty. So now you have the transfer of the best soldiers they have from the home county depots, from Ireland, over to the fields of France and Belgium once the line is stabilised after the Battle of the Marne, and then you have the trench line systems developing. From that point onwards, the Irish Americans want something for their money, and they want the green light to be pressed by Clark, McDermott, Hobson et al. In Dublin City for a rising. Now, all of this is going on behind the scenes. No one sees that. There's echoes of it, there's some minor manifestations of it. There's things that confuse RIC intelligence and DMP intelligence, and certainly British military intelligence, later Major Ivan Price and others. They couldn't quite understand how these pieces fitted together. And it is complicated. And it was meant to be. Because within all these groups you have the elements, the cadres that are active and know the story, surrounded by people who have an idea, surrounded by people who are helping out, surrounded by people who haven't got a bloody clue, but they're prepared to get involved, they're prepared to do what can be done. And that is the nature of revolutionary organisations in the early part of the 20th century, certainly those that have any chance of success. The onset of war did change the circumstances. So the strategic opportunity was presented, and then a number of events began to impel the hardcore towards the moment of action. One was that John Redmond, who pushed himself into the commanding position in the Irish Volunteers by virtue of threatening to either take them over or destroy them, he would have split them to the point it would have been problematic. He pushed his Irish Parliamentary Party supporters into the volunteer movement, and then they wanted a controlling interest. Well, they got a controlling interest, but when he made his unauthorised speech in September 1914 in Woodbridge, County Wicklow, that the volunteers should fight for Ireland in Flanders, something that surprised most of his own followers, that led to a split of the movement. And I think it's important to make this point. Most of those who left the authority of Owen MacNeill, the titular commander of the volunteers, did not go to Flanders. They went home. Right? Very relatively few of those who split went to the front. Now, an awful lot of Irishmen did, including many members of my own family, many of whom were killed. It's not a comment on the soldiers. They were individually courageous and chose their own path in life. They were misled. They were misled by Redmond. They were misled by the British government. They died for nothing except creating the Second World War, which I don't think is a good result. It was a tragedy, an unmitigated tragedy. But nonetheless, what you have left is the moderate nationalists go home, and the ones who are a little bit more made of sterner stuff stay under MacNeill and effectively under the IRB. So you now have a good corpus. You now have maybe 15, 20,000 men, because their strength increased again after that, by the way. And some of those who split came back in. And the IRB began to, induct more and more people they thought were the right sort. You get the sinews that would enable a major arms showing in the capital, with significant supporting activities in all urban major centres, supported, of course, by sabotage and interdiction in rural Ireland. What they needed was a substantial amount of modern military equipment. They had more than people knew. And you think about it, a couple of thousand rebels did turn out in 1916 who were fully armed. Some of them had pretty good equipment, some of them had poor level equipment, but they were armed. And they're in a position to hold Dublin City for a week, which is no mean feat, believe you me, and that had not been anticipated by anybody, including the rebels themselves. So, MacNeill, being more or less the slightly ill-informed figurehead, just in the way that Dennis McCulloch had a very strong position in the IRB, which was not matched by his actual authority, being outmanoeuvred by those in the circle, were effectively being controlled by the Military Council of the IRB. And that, at the behest of Clark and McDermott, was originally Pearse, joined by Cant, later by MacDonagh, by Plunkett. And Plunkett, who appears to be a rather... Plunkett gets a bad press because he was always dying, and Plunkett was on the way out, in 1916, and he wasn't long for this earth in any conditions. Maybe he secured a better legacy for himself by being shot than simply, God forbid, dying in a hospital, right? But, it's a sad situation. When he secretly went to New York in 1914 to liaise with the German kind of legation there, he was so stricken visibly with TB that he was quarantined, and he had to be sprung out of quarantine by $1,000 surety and the intervention of an Irish-American senator, James A. Gorman. But that's the type of clout the clan had. They could do these things. So back in Ireland, the decision was they used the excuse of the Easter Rising to mobilise their forces, to enter the Dublin city centre, and starting in Dublin, a la Emmet in 1803, they would seize the major command centres and isolate those they couldn't control. Now, they had hoped to have at least 2,000 men fully armed, with several thousand auxiliaries and indeed associates elsewhere in the country doing supporting actions to prevent the transfer of reinforcements immediately. Because as you well know, every sizable town in Ireland had a barracks. Every single hamlet had an RIC barracks. Now an RIC barracks might be a house, or it might be something with 50 or 100 men in it, but they're a paramilitary police force. The prototype for all colonial police forces in the British Empire. So they thought they were doing something right. It seemed to work in '67, didn't work in 1916. Suffice it to say that those arms did not arrive, because as well known, the odd arms ship from Germany was scuttled off Don's Rock on the Cork coast, having failed to rendezvous at Finbar Pier due to communication issues and changes in plans that were not correctly communicated. Separately, Roger Casement was landed by the U-19 and was arrested near Bannostrand, and of course he acted in a rather unwise manner by insisting in Tralee that he be allowed to contact Owen MacNeill urgently. Very foolish. But the man was distressed and ill, so we've got to give him a pass. You know, he paid a high price for his support of Irish democracy. But he did not act well. Now, it wasn't treacherous, he was just unguarded. When MacNeill realised the extent of the revolutionary preparations that had taken place unbeknownst to him, he issued his famous countermanding order. Well, there wasn't one countermanding order, there were hundreds of them. And the one that mattered was the one carried in the Sunday Independent. No comment on that, but the point being that it was very effective in that people who thought they were to rise that day, mobilise that day, Easter Sunday, were now told don't do it, which gave everyone the nod. I wonder why aren't we doing it? Is this the big one? They'd already practiced this in March, on 17th of March, the same year, very effectively, where 2,000 Dublin volunteers took over the city centre of Dublin. And they did it then, for hours, clearly, Easter Sunday was the big one, a secret that not many were privy to. Pearse, of course, was determined to press ahead, and after consultation with Connolly, who had become a firm part and a central part of their plans from January 1916 secretly, they pressed ahead. The ICA had one advantage, well, maybe others. They were not affected by the split. They were not affected by the temporise around Home Rule. They had no interest in Home Rule. That was not something that was a significant part of their agenda, but perhaps Finbar will address that later. In the heat of the hunt, the net effect of the loss of the odd, the countermanding order, was that only a pale shadow of the circa 10,000-15,000 men who should have turned out did. The ones who went into the GPO to start at the headquarters of the Irish Republic and the Army of the Republic, under James Connolly and Patrick Pearse, were told to bring 2 days' worth of rations. It's quite clear that they'd hoped to be able to hold out in a symbolic building, which was bulletproof, but not shell-proof, for about two days, possibly a little bit more. Think about this. In all 4 battalion areas, every single battalion headquarters was extant at the end of the Rising. Many of the important outlying positions were extant at the end of the Rising, because there was fierce urban fighting. It would have been amongst the most violent urban fighting the British Army had ever conducted. It was something they were not trained in, had not practiced, and did not form part of the general experience, certainly not the general experience on the Western Front, or indeed in Mesopotamia, or indeed in the disaster that was Churchill's Dardanelles campaign. So they weren't used to that type of fighting. But nor were the IRA. And mark my words, they were called the IRA in 1916, and you will see numerous contemporaneous references to that. This is part of the business of how do you package the Rising. Later on, people didn't want the rebels to be called the IRA, but that's what they were called at the time. The IRA was a term adopted by General Headquarters in 1917. Not true. Demonstrably, factually, actually used by the rebels in 1916. So who does not want us to call them the IRA? Those who want to separate the legacy of Ogoni from that of the volunteers, as if they're a different organisation, which they're not. We're not. So to move on and to summarise, the 6 days of the Republic were a qualified success. In one respect, it was extraordinary. What happened in the second city of the Empire was taken over by a very small number of outnumbered people who withstood fierce attack. After the attacks of South Dublin Union, after the probing attacks around O'Connell Street, the British treated the rebels, or the IRA, with a very healthy respect. The casualties they endured, famously around Haddington Road, Northumberland Road, Mount Street Bridge sector, were very severe. The fighting in and around North King Street and the axis running to the rear of the GPO was fierce. Some of the outlying barricade positions were only reduced with the direct fire of artillery. The British bought up from Athlone 18-pounders. 18-pounders were about the largest piece of ordnance you're going to get cross-country in this country. This is heavy-duty stuff. It's not just the Helga, it's the heavy artillery they used to pound and destroy the commercial heart of the second city of the Empire, the post-capital or not. This was serious. The real political military point was that by having an incontrovertible major arms showing, that effect would be given to this, the 1916 proclamation. The purpose of the arms showing was to declare the Irish Republic and invoke other powers to recognise the Irish Republic, to indispose the British to carrying out the inevitable counterattack that they would win. You cannot defeat them if they have political will in London. Now, it's worth reading a few sections of this before I have a few general comments on how this has been treated these days and pass over to my friend. This is the provisional government of the Irish Republic, the people of Ireland. Provisional government. In other words, it's not a dictatorship. You know, we're not taking over. We're not a new House of Lords, a bunch of unelected clowns. You know, we represent a republic, which means it's ergo democratic. You'll get a chance to vote, not tomorrow, but soon. And it says Irish men and Irish women, in the name of God and the dead generations for which he receives our old tradition of nationhood, Ireland through us summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom. There are very few international documents in the world that started then with Irish men and Irish women, because no women had the vote. This is very significant. Meanwhile, as this has been read, Commonamon are there. It's not just Countess Markovich and Margaret Skinner and a handful of extremely interesting, brave women. The Commonamon are throughout That's the history gods telling me to stop talking.
Maybe Dennis O'Brien.
Oh, he's listening all right, you can be sure of that. Now, this is where they named the groups involved. The first group named, is the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Not the second, not the third, not the fourth, the first group, because it's an IRB revolt using the vehicle of Ogoni. And just Finbar's familiar with this, but it's not well known. The IRB at war always calls themselves the IRA. When they invaded Canada in 1866 from Buffalo, upstate New York, western New York, they were the IRA once they went over the border. So the translation Irish Republican Army of Ogoni signifies the IRB. And there's other things in there. Those who know, and those who didn't know weren't meant to. It's just the way it was. The Irish Citizen Army named second. Now, while they've been involved in joint parades and joint demonstrations, particularly at Bodenstown, very effectively, Michael Mallon was the guy who commanded the ICA contingents at Bodenstown that year, and indeed the full involvement of the Hibernian Rifles, Commonamon, the Fianna Éireann, and the IRA as such, Ogoni at the O'Donnell and Rosser funeral on the 1st of August 1915. It could not be certain that they would be standing shoulder to shoulder at the moment of truth. And their commander in Dublin was James Connolly, of all in Dublin was James Connolly, and he referred to them generically as the Army of the Republic. The Army of the Republic is the IRA plus the ICA. Now, here's what it matters. And listen to these words and remember James Lawler, Fenton Lawler, James Connolly, and indeed an acolyte to this line of thinking, Patrick Pearse. Pearse's radicalism is often considerably underrated. We declare the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland and to the unfettered control of Irish destinies to be sovereign and indefeasible. The long usurpation of that right by our foreign people and government has not extinguished the right, nor can ever be extinguished except by the destruction of the Irish people, which had nearly happened in the 1840s. It had nearly happened. A quarter of our country wiped out, and another third of the survivors driven across the Atlantic and to the UK. In every generation, the Irish people have asserted the right to national freedom and sovereignty. 6 times during the past 300 years, they have asserted it in arms. In other words, this is an armed revolution. Don't say, you didn't see it coming. We've done it before, and here we are now. We proclaim the Irish Republic as a sovereign, independent state. Don't want your home rule. We have national self-determination, which must be predicated on the sovereignty of the citizen. Okay? The Irish Republic is entitled to, and hereby claims, the allegiance of every Irishman and every Irish woman. The Republic guarantees religious and civil liberty, equal rights and equal opportunities to all its citizens. Now, what they're saying is, you don't have that now. But this is what us, the provisional government, want to give you, so get behind it. But specifically, they broadcast this, literally broadcast it from the GPO. It's sent by radio incessantly when they rigged up a wireless transmitter across the road from the GPO. It's a famous event in terms of a pure broadcast because they wanted Washington DC and Berlin and Paris to ratify this. That's the point of the Rising. Now, there's more to the Rising than that, but that's the key point to the Rising. And it's signed by Clark, the retired Fenian, the guy who owns a newspaper shop, That's what they looked at him like. Although the Dublin Metropolitan Police detected otherwise. Sean McDermott, Thomas McDonough, P.H. Pearce, Eamon Keant, James Connolly and Joseph Plunkett. That's the Military Council. The Military Council comprising themselves of the provincial government and headquartered in the GPO. That's Dennis again. Well, moving on, I'm going to conclude now because there's much more to be discussed, and I'll be around for the rest of the day, and Finbar will have a different perspective on this. If it's deemed significant that our Declaration of Independence is important, as it would be uncontested in America and is in France, then this should be a central document to our civic discourse, and not just when it happens to be 100 years later, but all the time. This should be something. I'm not saying we want our kids to recite it every day with a pledge. I'm saying this should be something that we should have in the day-to-day conversation of this country, of this nation. But it isn't. You'll hear excuses in the past, 1966 caused the Northern Troubles. No. The partition of Ireland and the disgraceful maltreatment of the Northern Nationalists caused the modern reincarnation of the Irish Troubles. Not celebrating 1916 and 66. Rubbish. In 1996, you try to celebrate that in 1996, you'll have a great deal of attention from the special branch. And people like Robert Balla were very physically and personally and financially courageous to stand up and do what they did, which is a very measured, reasonable, citizen-based approach to just noting that this is important and it is relevant. If you believe that the ideals of this proclamation are still important, such as, happiness and prosperity of the whole nation and of all of its parts, cherishing the children of the nation equally, and oblivious to the differences carefully fostered by any government, if you think that's important now, it should be extolled. It should be celebrated. This is a document we should be proud of, not hiding in a closet. It's not. The 24th of April is not Republic Day. We don't have any Republic Day. We have no significant constitutional holiday in our country. We'll be discouraged from talking about it. And those who have, like Tom Stokes, are being ridiculed. Not by those who are politically au fait or savvy, but by, those who are cynical, who are always out there lurking. 1966 was celebrated, and 1996 was celebrated by increasingly small amounts of people who were coerced out of, saying, we believe this is important. So what is the challenge now for the current commemoration? Well, I'm not going to say too much about it today, and Finbar's going to riff on some of these things and discuss them possibly far more deep than me. The first attempt to roll out what the government was going to do was met with disbelief. It's not just that they didn't get the Irish right, it's just that they didn't have any rebels in the 1916 documentary. They had a British monarch in it, which is nice for her, I suppose. I don't think she'd care, but they had many things, but nary a Pierce about the place, Okay, what would be the agenda? Is it only going to be for tourism? No, I think tourism is something that's very important in Ireland. It might be our greatest hope for long-term economic prosperity everywhere, as long as we don't destroy our environment. Well, yes, I think that's not a bad thing inherently. A gathering with no guns, pictures of old guns, well, all right. Do we have any unfinished business in this country? Well, of course we do. There's multi-levels of unfinished business in this country, which are going to oppress our generation and those that come after us if they're not resolved in this generation. So let's not kid ourselves here. There are significant salient issues in play that need to be addressed, even if certain newspapers are unwilling to have an honest discussion about it. It doesn't mean one has to extol any specific organisation or strategy or tactic, but I'm not going to regard as credible any argument that tells me this is not a central document and the 1916 was not a seminal event. So I'll stop talking and hand over to my friend with your permission. And if I raise any question you want to discuss with me later on, I'm quite happy to do so. So thank you for listening.
Ready? Yeah. Okay, well thanks very much for the invitation to speak here. I'm not used to speaking publicly, so I'm renowned for being a bit soft. So if you can't hear me at the back, tell me. So, okay, the first thing I want to say, thanks to Ruan for all the kind remarks, but I'm not going to talk about much of what you mentioned. Basically, this is my kind of AA moment. My name is Finbar Cullen. I'm a political activist, and I have been all my adult life. That's the perspective I'm going to talk about today. I was active in Republican politics for a long number of years. Second thing I want to say about that is I am a Marxist, and before everyone runs out of the room, there's 4 things I want to say about it, and you won't hear any more about that later on. But the reason I'm saying it is that that's the context in which I understand history and society and so on. So very quickly, the 4 things are: 1, Marxism is a theory of human action. What Marx says is that history doesn't do anything, that men and women, by the things they do, create history, they create society, they create social change. Second thing that we say is that everything exists in relationships, nothing is disconnected. So, for example, this shirt I'm wearing is probably made in Pakistan or somewhere. So that brings me into a whole load of social relationships with people. People who grew the cotton, the people who made it being exploited in Pakistan, the people who transported it here, so on, the people who sell it in pennies or wherever they sell it. They're not the relationships of my choosing, but they are actual, real, existing social relations. And everything in society is connected in those ways, and that's what we kind of look for, those relationships and those connections. The third thing is that history is a process, just like the connection in relationships. Nothing is, static, stands on its own. So something like the 1916 Rising, we try and see it in connection with the things that happened before and the things that happened afterwards. And the last thing I want to say about Marxism, again, just because people sometimes get frightened, for me, Marxism and historical materialism, they don't provide answers. They provide you with a way of looking at things and give you tools to look at history to try and understand it. But if you come along like thinking that you have a ready-made answer before you even look at a thing, that's not what it's about. So the title I gave myself for this, having spoken to Maura, was The 1916 Rising, Labour and the Irish Revolution, and that's the perspective I'm going to come at it from. The first thing I want to say is that when we look at the 1916 Rising, we tend to look at it as a Republican and nationalist event. When the role of Labour in it is recognised, we tend to see it either as a supportive role or sometimes as a parallel one, somewhat marginalised. A few have also seen it as an abandonment of the principles of the labour movement by participating in it. But obviously there's sound, and substantial historical facts to support the idea that the Rising and the Irish Revolution, was substantially a Republican and nationalist event, and I have no quibble with that. I think, listening to what Ruan has said, there should be no question that we should honour and respect the men and women of the Revolution and their achievements, which, as he pointed out, were made in the face of considerable odds. The British Empire, at more or less the height of its powers, and very little real or substantial support for Ireland from the other nations of Europe and the world. But what I want to say about it is not the question that at all, but I think in order to deepen our understanding of what happened in that period and to draw lessons for today, that we need to some extent, not fully, but some extent, put aside the received wisdoms we have about that period, 1913 to 23, and look at the thing from a different perspective, and we need to put the Rising back into the context and the circumstances in which it took place to try and understand it then. So that's what I'm going to try and do, and then talk about the politics of it. The first thing about Ireland in those years is that there was a ferment of thinking and organisation and activism throughout the country. The political, economic, social and cultural practices and structures were being challenged by both reformers and by revolutionaries. The republicanism, nationalism and separatism were central actors in that period, but they weren't the only ones. And lots of other people were very important in this period: the labour movement, trade unions and socialism, the women's movement and feminism, pacifism and the anti-war movement, the language movement, the cultural and literary revivals, the cooperative movement, self-help movement, the Gaelic Athletic Association, and right up to the 1920s there was continuing land agitation. In spite of British legislation at the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century, that question hadn't been fully settled. And all of those things, I'm arguing, contribute in significant ways to the revolution that's taking place at that time. Also at that time, again, as Ruan has touched on, the Irish Parliamentary Party, to some extent, certainly before the Rising in that period, dominated Irish nationalism. They were pressing for Home Rule legislation in the British Parliament, which they did succeed in 1912 and 1914. Unionism was mobilising, and they were preparing to oppose Home Rule throughout Ireland. The Ulster Volunteer Force was established in 1913. They received, interestingly enough, significant support from leadership of the British Army and the British Conservative Party. And of course, again, as Ruan mentioned, in August 1914 the First World War broke out. Though I think broke out is probably the wrong word, but you know, the great powers were struggling for dominance and leadership in a world that was increasingly controlled by imperialism. So that's the context in which the 1916 Rising took place, which was followed by renewed political struggle and then by war between 1919 and 21, and later, of course, civil war. The core of what I want to say today is based on the next thing. For me, at the core of the Irish Revolution was a demand for democracy, sovereignty and independence. Contrary to some of the stuff that's written nowadays, this wasn't the pursuit of a romantic ideal or some abstract political theory. The people at that time, the revolutionaries, they saw that as the practical means of securing the interests of the Irish people and of all of the forces that contributed to the revolution. And I think that is the principal lesson that we need to learn from 1916, that democracy, sovereignty and independence are prerequisites for achieving our goals today. So, I mean, obviously, it might seem obvious to people, but the question I would ask myself starting off is, what are democracy, sovereignty and independence? And it might seem obvious, but I'm going to go through that now. Democracy to me means the people have real decision-making power over their own lives and over all aspects of their society. And for me that means it must include the economy as well as the political, the social and the cultural spheres. Having the right to vote every 5 years to choose one party or another to govern us, there's no real democratic content in that. The reason we were made to pay for the crisis through austerity and the imposition of the private banking debt on us is because we don't have any real democratic power in the system. And it's the same reason that 100 years after the lockout, workers can't get basic rights to organise in unions and be represented in their places of work. You know, 100 years later, we still have government with the Labour Party and it can't bring in simple legislation like that. It's also, I'd say, and I'm going to touch briefly on Corrib at the end. I know very little about it, but I will put in the content. But just here, it's also, I would argue, the reason why we can't determine whether or not the Corrib gas should be exploited, and if it is, how it should be exploited, because we don't have real decision-making power over that. It's away from our control. So, what does real decision-making power over the economy mean? For me, that means if we have real decision-making power over what happens in the economy, we have to have control over all the resources and all the wealth in the country. We have to be able to decide if those resources are going to be exploited, to what uses they're going to be put. Then when something is produced out of that wealth is created, we have to be able to decide how that wealth is distributed and who gets it. So, I mean, for me, if we mean these things when we say them, having democratic power, democratic decision-making power over the economy is equivalent to social control, that society controls the thing, and I think it means democratic ownership, which is social ownership of the entire economy. Can I keep going? So, I don't know, that sounds very radical, but I mean, I would say that this idea of democracy is actually at the core of the 1916 Rising and the Irish Revolution, and that there's nothing new in it and there's nothing that's a departure in it, but we need to get back to that. And I'm going to try to illustrate it maybe rather than prove it. I have 5 quotations from the people at the time, and I'm going to let them speak for themselves. I'm going to repeat one that Ruan mentioned earlier, but it's from the 1916 proclamation. We declared the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland and to the unfettered control of Irish destinies to be sovereign and indefeasible. The second one is from James Connolly, writing in the Workers' Republic in 1916. He says, "The labour movement of Ireland must set itself the reconquest of Ireland as its final aim. The reconquest involves taking possession of the entire country, all its powers of wealth production and all its natural resources, and organising these on a cooperative basis for the good of all." The third one is from the Constitution of the Irish Citizen Army, which was written in 1913, and that the first and last principle of the Irish Citizen Army is the avowal that the ownership of Ireland, moral and material, is vested in the people of Ireland. The fourth one, which personally I think is one of the most radical, and as Ruan alluded to, I think Patrick Pearse has been not dismissed, but certainly underrated as a radical thinker. But this is from The Sovereign People, which was published in 1916, and I always like the fact that Pearse said something to the effect that these are his last words, he had nothing more to say after this point. I mean, he had said what he had to say. So what he said then was that the nation's sovereignty extends not only to all the material possessions of the nation's soil and all its resources, all wealth and all wealth-producing processes within the nation. In other words, no private right to property is good as against the public right of the nation. But the nation is under a moral obligation so to exercise its public right as to secure strictly equal rights and liberties to every man and woman within the nation. The final one is from the Democratic Programme, which was passed in Dáil Éireann in 1919. The original draft was written by Tom Johnson of the Labour Party, but overnight, before the 21st of January, Michael Collins and the IRB, who receives Johnson's draft from Harry Boland, are generally considered to have made it a little bit less radical. Interesting enough, some of the things they're said to have taken out includes some allusions to things in the proclamation and some things to allusions in Patrick Pearse. But even still, it's a reasonable enough document in lots of ways. What the Democratic Programme says is relevant to this definition of democracy is, "We declare, in the words of the Irish Republican Proclamation, the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland and to the unfettered control of Irish destinies to be indefeasible." And in the language of the first president, Pádraig MacPhirish, "We declare that the nation's sovereignty extends not only to all men and women of the nation, but to all its resources, all the wealth and all the wealth-producing processes within the nation, and with him we reaffirm that all rights to private property must be subordinated to the public rights and welfare." So I think, again, that's there all the time, and I'm not going to talk about the commemorations except to say here that